If you grew up in the 80s, there's a good chance you ran home from school, grabbed a snack, and sat in front of the TV to hear the words,
By the power of Grayskull!
He-Man and the Masters of the Universe wasn't just another cartoon. It was a full-blown cultural explosion that took over toy aisles, lunchboxes, and Saturday mornings. Today, we're diving into 10 wild facts about the original 1983 He-Man cartoon that most fans never knew. Before we start, subscribe to Pure Nostalgia and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our trips back to the greatest era of cartoons and toys.
Fact 1. He-Man was born from Mattel's big mistake. Our story starts with a massive oops at Mattel. In the late 70s, the company had the chance to get the Star Wars license for action figures, and they said no. When Star Wars toys went on to dominate the market, Mattel realized that they had made one of the worst calls in toy history. So they decided, we're never making that mistake again. Instead of waiting for the next movie, Mattel chose to create its own fantasy universe from scratch. They mixed barbarian heroes inspired by Conan, science fiction elements, and sword and sorcery aesthetics. Out of that mix came Eternia, Skeletor, Castle Grayskull, and of course, He-Man himself. In a way, He-Man exists because Mattel turned regret into creativity and decided to build a franchise that they would own completely. Fact 2. There were 3 different He-Mans at the start. The He-Man we know, the blonde barbarian in furry shorts and a chest harness, wasn't the only option on the table. Early concept art from Mattel shows 3 very different versions of the character. One was the barbarian we recognize, clearly influenced by Conan. Huge muscles, sword, and a more primitive warrior look. Another version was a space hero with a more sci-fi design, laser-style weapons, and futuristic armor. A third leaned toward a high-tech soldier, more like a sci-fi commando than a fantasy champion. Mattel tested these concepts internally and with focus groups. The barbarian hero tested the strongest with kids, especially boys, who were obsessed with strength and sword power. That direction shaped everything, from the look of He-Man, to the design of his enemies, to the overall muscle fantasy aesthetic of the entire line. If the space hero concept had won, Masters of the Universe might have looked more like Star Wars than Conan.
Fact 3. The cartoon was basically a legal loophole to sell toys. In the early 80s, U.S. regulations were very strict about turning cartoons into 20-minute commercials for toys. Networks and Saturday morning blocks were heavily watched, and there were concerns about advertising directly to children. But Mattel and Filmation found a way around those rules. Instead of airing He-Man as a traditional network Saturday morning show, they released it directly into syndication. Local stations could buy the show and air it in after-school slots. Because it wasn't part of the Saturday morning cartoon system, it avoided some of the tightest restrictions about being a commercial for toys. So yes, He-Man absolutely existed to sell action figures, but the writers and animators still cared about story and characters. They added morals at the end of each episode, lessons about honesty, courage, and responsibility, which helped justify the show as educational and not just a toy catalog. Fact 4. 130 episodes in 2 years, an animation factory. Most modern animated shows produce maybe 10 to 20 episodes a season. He-Man's production schedule was on a completely different level. Between 1983 and 1985, Filmation pumped out around 130 episodes in just 2 seasons. That means multiple episodes had to be written, boarded, voiced, and animated every single week. Writers talk about scripts being turned around at insane speed, sometimes finishing drafts only days before voice recording. Layout artists and animators had constant deadlines. This industrial-scale production is the reason He-Man could air 5 days a week in many markets. It felt like an ongoing daily event in kids' lives, not just a once-a-week treat.
Fact 5. He-Man recycled almost everything on screen. To hit those brutal deadlines and keep costs under control, Filmation reused animation like crazy. If you felt like you'd seen He-Man do the same running pose, the same punching motion, or the same transformation into Prince Adam 100 times, it's because you did. Stock animation cycles were created for common actions: He-Man running toward camera, Battle Cat leaping, Skeletor shaking his fist, Orko floating and spinning. These cycles were dropped into different episodes again and again, sometimes with only slight background changes. Filmation even reused animation tricks and techniques from older shows they had produced. This recycling became part of the show's visual identity. For 80s kids, those repeated shots became comforting, iconic even, like a visual catchphrase that signaled He-Man time. Fact 6. Rotoscoped muscles, real people under the animation. One thing that made He-Man stand out from other cartoons was how the characters moved. For a show with such a limited budget, the physicality actually looked surprisingly realistic, especially when He-Man swung his sword or struck a heroic pose. That's because the team used rotoscoping. They filmed live-action reference of actors and bodybuilders performing specific movements: running, jumping, swinging, lifting, heroic stances. Animators then traced over that footage frame by frame. This gave He-Man's muscles and stances a grounded, weighty feel. The result was a strange and fun mix, a very limited, repetitive animation style overall, but with key scenes that felt almost too real for a Saturday morning cartoon. For kids, it made He-Man feel more powerful, more tangible, like he could step out of the TV and into the toy aisle.
Fact 7. Robot villains to legalize explosions. If you remember He-Man smashing through walls, throwing enemies across the screen, or blowing up vehicles, you might also remember something else. A lot of the bad guys look suspiciously like robots. That was not an accident. Censorship guidelines were strict about showing violence against living beings in children's programming. But destroying robots and machines? That was much easier to get past the censors. So many of Skeletor's minions, or generic guards and soldiers, were drawn as robotic or clearly non-human. This allowed He-Man to punch, slice, toss, and wreck things in dramatic ways without technically hurting anyone. A lot of 80s action cartoons used this trick, but He-Man was one of the clearest examples. It's why you see so many sparks, metal parts, and lifeless bodies falling instead of blood or real injuries. Fact 8. One actor voiced Skeletor, Merman, and Cringer. Behind every great hero is a great villain, and behind several of those villains was the same voice. Actor Alan Oppenheimer voiced Skeletor, Merman, and Cringer, among others. That means that in scenes where those characters interact, Oppenheimer was literally talking to himself in different voices. Skeletor's nasal, mocking tone, Merman's gurgling underwater effect, and Cringer's cowardly, shaky delivery all came from the same performer, sometimes recorded back-to-back in the studio. This kind of voice doubling saved money and time, but it also gave the show a unique sound identity. Once you know it's the same guy, it's hard not to hear the connection. But as kids, we just accepted them as totally different personalities. Fact 9. Some episodes were written at the last minute. Because Filmation was racing to keep up with a daily schedule, some episodes came together under serious time pressure. Writers have described getting notes that simply said, "do better," or "more action here," before rushing to finish scripts. Despite that, the show managed to create memorable episodes and surprisingly heartfelt moments. Episodes dealing with fear, self-doubt, friendship, and even topics like disability ended up hitting kids emotionally. It's wild to think that some episodes we still remember today may have been finished only days before voice actors recorded them. On paper, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe was absolutely a marketing machine. It was designed to sell action figures, vehicles, and playsets. But in practice, it became something bigger. The show built a fully realized universe with its own mythology, moral structure, and emotional beats. For many kids, it was an introduction to fantasy worlds, heroic sacrifice, and the idea that strength should be used to protect others. The franchise outlived its original toy line, inspiring comics, spin-off series like She-Ra, reboots, and an entire multi-generational fanbase. It started as a clever way to move plastic off toy shelves and ended up as one of the most iconic cartoons of the 1980s. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe was raw, weird, cheap in places, and absolutely unforgettable. It's a perfect example of how something created for business reasons can still become genuine childhood magic. Now it's your turn. Which He-Man memory is strongest for you? Was it the transformation sequence, a specific episode, a toy you owned, or maybe Skeletor stealing the show? Tell us in the comments what He-Man meant to you. And if this video brought back good memories, subscribe to Pure Nostalgia, hit the like button, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the cartoons and toys that shaped our childhood.